I think covered calls just don't work for me. I'm barely bringing in any premium and all of my stocks are down in value.
Well, you should definitely be doing better than that. What stocks are you selling covered calls on?
Let's see. AMC, Uber, Lordstown Motors, GoPro, and AT&T. What?
So if you want to increase your covered call returns, just like Henry here, then you're in the right place because you're probably making some of the exact same mistakes that he is. And by the end of this video, you'll know how to avoid those mistakes so that you can double or even triple your returns going forward. So let's get into it. My name is Charlie, and on this channel I make videos about building wealth and achieving financial freedom so that you can free up your time to focus on the things that you truly care about. And the way I've done this myself is mainly through selling covered calls, which is an extremely powerful strategy, but only if you apply it properly and choose the right stocks. Now, stock selection seems simple, but it can absolutely make or break your strategy. And the way I see it, there's three main traps that many covered call writers fall into. The first is picking overly volatile speculative companies just because they yield high premiums. And this is very common amongst people who are new to covered call writing, and understandably so, because once you see how powerful collecting premiums can be, naturally you want to collect as much premium as possible. But eventually you'll see that there's a reason premiums are so high on stocks like that, and it's because they're more uncertain, more volatile, and therefore more likely to drop in value. So if you buy a stock at $100 per share, then collect $5 per share worth of premium, that's a great return. But if the stock drops 20% over the next week, all of a sudden you're down pretty significantly overall. And sure, you can keep collecting small premiums week after week by selling calls at your cost basis, but if the stock keeps dropping, you'll still be down overall. And even if the stock doesn't drop any further, it'll take a long time to recoup your losses due to the very small premiums you'll be bringing in at that point. So I don't think it's a bad idea to trade some more volatile stocks to bring in higher premiums, but you certainly don't want to keep your entire portfolio in these types of stocks unless you want your portfolio to look like this. And of the more volatile stocks that you do choose, you'll still want to be very careful. So they should still be stocks with solid fundamentals that you like for the long term, and we'll talk more about how to find those types of stocks later. But the second mistake that you're likely making with covered call writing is picking cheap stocks. And I get it, because covered call writing can be expensive since you need to buy 100 shares of a stock, but the truth is that you're just not going to achieve great returns consistently if you're trading smaller stocks. To be as successful as possible with covered call writing, you need to trade stocks that are going to increase in value consistently, which generally requires those stocks to have some level of institutional involvement. Because institutional investors account for over 85% of trading volume in the market, so these large players are the ones that really create movement in a stock. And if you imagine a cyclist drafting behind their competition to save energy during a race, that's essentially what we're doing with institutional buyers. We're riding the trends that those institutions create as they dump money into a stock, pushing the price higher. So those institutional investors tend to like established blue chip companies like those in the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 with consistently growing revenue and often that pay a dividend. So unfortunately with cheaper stocks, there's a reason that those stocks are cheap, and it's because they just don't have that same level of institutional involvement. And let me tell you, I know this from experience because I made this exact mistake in my Road to Financial Freedom portfolio, which I cover on this channel. I started that portfolio with $5,000, so if I wanted to sell covered calls, I was forced to trade relatively cheaper stocks in the $10 to $30 range. And while I did okay at first, bringing in decent premiums for the first few months, those stocks just didn't have the institutional involvement pushing them higher, despite the companies having relatively strong fundamentals. And eventually most of my stocks had fallen in value pretty significantly, leading to overall poor performance in that portfolio. But since then, I've transitioned to selling more poor man's covered calls on solid stocks rather than traditional covered calls on cheap stocks, and I've seen much better performance. And in my main portfolio that I use for income, I've achieved pretty solid returns all along since I've always traded mostly solid blue chip stocks. And aside from seeing better long-term performance in that portfolio, it's just a lot less stressful to look at since those blue chip stocks don't fluctuate wildly in value from week to week. Now the next mistake, which I often see made even by experienced covered call writers, is picking neutral trending stocks rather than the upward trending stocks of strong growing companies. And this leads people to see very underwhelming results with the strategy and sometimes even write it off altogether. So I think it's a common misconception, and maybe you've even thought this yourself that since you're limiting your upside when selling covered calls, you should sell them on stocks that tend not to rise in value. And I've certainly thought that way in the past, but I've since realized that that way of thinking is completely backwards. Because half of the benefit of covered call writing is that you get to take part in the rise of the stock by selling out of the money calls. So when you're selling calls against neutral trending stocks, sure, you're collecting premiums, but number one, those premiums will be lower because people aren't willing to pay as much to buy those calls, but also you're missing out on a huge moneymaker, which is the capital gains you bring in from getting your shares called away from you. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to trade extremely risky, high-flying stocks. I'm still talking about established companies here that tend to rise over time, like Apple, Microsoft, Nike, and Home Depot. Those types of stocks are no riskier to trade than those more neutral trending value stocks like AT&T, American Airlines, ExxonMobil, Verizon, GE, and so on. In fact, I'd actually say that they're less risky, as value stocks have underperformed the greater market for quite a long time now, as shown by this chart from Vanguard. Because again, there's a reason that those stocks are undervalued, and it's because nobody wants to buy them. So our job is to pick the stocks that the market actually wants to push higher. And in this video, I talked about exactly how to do that, so I'd recommend checking that one out next. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in that next video.